Hello and welcome to the Game Dev London podcast, a community of amazing people who love talking about and sharing their love of the details behind making games, whether or not they're actually based in London. I'm your host, Oscar Clark, he, him pronouns, and I am on a quest to understand everything you wanted to know about game dev, but never dared to ask. And today I am delighted to be joined by Tom Penrose from Code Wizards. Tom, good to see you. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, great to be here. So my name's Tom. I have been working in the games industry for the last 15 years, he, him pronouns, and my whole games industry career has been in back-end game tech. Ultimately, how do we make sure that multiplayer games stay online and players keep playing?
Absolutely. And I think this is one of those areas that personally I'm incredibly impressed with the importance of, not least because that's how I got started in the games industry. Back in 1998, yes, I am that old, I was involved with good wireplay, online gaming on dial-up modems, and I had an obsession with Quake and all those ilk. And obviously, I've on this podcast, I've often gone into my joy of the fact that we were one of the earliest places which tested Counter-Strike, and that I like to pretend I saved Counter-Strike because I bought their computers just before they got bought by Valve. But the point is that, you know, this era of connected experiences, starting in the late 90s on dial-up, is still incredibly important to this day and probably dominant, I would argue, in some ways. I mean, how do you, what's your kind of, what is it about multiplayer that kind of grabs your attention?
Okay, well, let's start with the story. So my first early experience of multiplayer was when we had 56k dial-up modem at home, and it was plugged into the wall, and me and my brother were both pretty much gaming fanatics, and we would get half an hour allocated slots to play games. And I'm not joking, it would be half an hour on the minute. We'd run downstairs, rip the cable out the wall and plug it into our computer, and we got half an hour. And ever since then, it's really been a passion of mine, right? Going up through college and university and playing different games, LAN parties, and really the community that comes with playing online games, for me is the biggest thing, right? Like we get to build connections with people that we would never have got to build connections with before over a love of something shared. And so for me, like embracing that multiplayer challenge, because it is a challenge, and having incredible games, you know, supporting players playing all over the world, that's for me is the love of the game, should we say?
Oh, absolutely. And let's you mentioned there the LAN parties thing. Obviously, you know, we both have a connection with a certain experience which came out of the LAN party, and in my case, I happen to be the original sponsor. And I've got loads of thanks and praise for people like Craig Fletcher, who set up Multiplay, who set up Insomnia. There's a whole story about the name Insomnia and whether British Telecom owned it or whether he owned it, and obviously he owns it now, absolutely 100%, and should. And anyway, the point I'm getting to is that there was an experience where I can't remember exactly where it was. I think it was a motorcycle museum or something like that. I can't remember exactly. And we were, I think it was just at the time 350 people doing a LAN party in the very first Insomnia. If I remember, I may be misremembering. This is my memory of it. We blew out the main substation. They had terrible trouble, and yet it was the most incredible experience. But even you know, even if you don't think about multiplayer, even if you think about just sitting there with your own machine, your 4 mates or 5 mates sitting around the corner and trying to plug in, trying to get Netgear stuff to work, which was, yeah, it was a challenge back in the day where you had to actually physically type in, you know, addresses and stuff like that. What was your kind of first experience with LAN parties, and when did you get involved with kind of the live experience of something like the Insomnia?
Yeah, absolutely. So this was, when did I first get involved? Well, really, it's yeah, it was back when I was a kid. I think actually I must have been under 16 because I think my mum had to sign a consent form for me to go to my first Insomnia. And obviously, gaming mad, you know, like it's basically gaming heaven, isn't it? You know, it's just the absolute best place on earth. And yeah, just remember 4 straight days of playing every game I wanted and eating whatever I wanted. And it was just the most incredible experience. And remember at the time, you know, the industry has come on so much that we didn't really have proper internet connections at home back then. So this was the times when actually going to LAN party was the best way that you could play multiplayer games, mostly for most people. Like, it just really wasn't possible. And the industry has come on so much and so far since then. So we eventually grew. Insomnia ended up at, you know, nearly 4,000 people, right? Absolute huge network and a big thing to build. But what really stood out was the fact that when people went home from those events, they needed somewhere to continue playing, right? Because that was only twice a year, 3 times a year, and we had game servers that we would host, and really that whole ecosystem around online gaming has built to the massive thing that it is now, which is everyone has an Xbox or a PC or even a mobile phone that they can play a game on with someone else. And actually, the kind of connected world of games has grown exponentially.
No, I think actually the attendance level of Insomnia was around 40,000, not 4,000 people. So you think about 40,000 people. I know you probably just misspoke there. It just, that is incredible. I mean, I think in that place they had like nearly, well, just under 3,000 people doing the bring your own computer and LAN party experience as well. And you know, that to
yes,
me
exactly what I was talking about. Yeah.
I just think it's astounding, you know, and I'm so glad because I, you know, obviously for those who don't know, Insomnia was sold to Game a few years back, and now Craig now has the rights back, as I understand it, for the show, and I think he's rerunning the show now. So the fact that that show is not just about connecting people through gameplay, but is also connecting streamers to audiences, I think is also incredible. And the fact that they have areas of stalls for game developers to show off their games at the same time is a testament to I think really the fundamental fact here, which is that we are creatures of play. We are social creatures, and playing together is a fundamental nature of what play, I would argue, what play is about. We you know, don't get me wrong, I love playing solo. Ironically, I actually am a massively solo gamer. So I want to play in a world where there are lots of people, but I don't want to bother me. But I don't know I mean, how do you feel? I mean, have you changed your gaming habits at all? I mean, what do you think is the importance of that connection in the game?
Yeah. For me, I've always been a teamwork gamer, right? So I love that kind of clan mentality, and if you go left, I can go right, and then we can figure out a strategy together. That's always been my thing. But I think everyone interacts with an online multiplayer game differently, right? But I think fundamentally, like. Yeah, absolutely, and it's just what you want differently from your gaming experience, right? I think also sometimes as you grow a bit older, sometimes you've got less times to play on games, got less time to spend with other people playing on games, and actually a quick a single player game is fantastic. But yeah, it's a bit of everything, and for me, it's about the different types of experiences that come out of those. I
mean, to be honest, the main reason I don't play team-based, well, 2 reasons I don't play team-based games. One is I'm older. I'm not 14-year-old anymore. Therefore, I don't have the right. I've always also been a bit dyspraxic, so I've never been that good. I've always been very capable of understanding how to play. So when you get a new game, I was always okay for the first couple of hours, and then as soon as anybody with any skill turns up, I'm demolished. So it gets to the point where it's not as much fun because you can't play to the same standard as other people. But also,
and actually, this is a really interesting challenge that we've got in the industry right now, which is ultimately the skill-based matchmaking challenge. So I will put it out there and say that aside from scaling hundreds of thousands of servers all over the world for games that have gone mad, matchmaking is probably one of the most technical challenges. When you start to break it down, matchmaking seems super easy, right? Grab a bunch of people, put them together, and let them play a game. Okay, so now let's consider what region they're located in, right? Because we want to put people close together so they don't have lag and latency. Okay, that's cool. Yeah. Now we need to start considering what internet connections they've got, who's got high quality connections, who hasn't, whether they're in a tournament league or whether they're in just a normal kind of play session. Then we start considering the skill problem, right? Which is ultimately we don't want to put people with really high skill with people with low skill, because the folks that are newer to the game and maybe don't have the skills are going to get absolutely obliterated and not have any fun. So then we start matchmaking based on skill set. Then we start matchmaking based on rank and level and achievement and different map and different play style and different game mode. And you can see how you fragment your player base, which might only be, say, 1,000 players for a game, into these tiny pools, and no one could get a match with each other. So it's such a difficult challenge. But the core point that you're saying, right, is how do we make a player have an amazing experience? And that might be not getting killed that much at the beginning, right? Because they want to feel good about playing the game. And the tech stack should do that, but it is so difficult.
But it's not just the tech stack. The game does. I mean, I as a designer, for me, it's the design part as much as it is the tech part. So even with like a deck building kind of game, we've got a deck building game we're making at the moment. And yes, you can get people to play against, but if you don't have a pool of players who can see long-term connection and long-term engagement and progression, and the fact that they can compete with enough people over time, you can't get critical mass. But how do you test that game to get it to the stage where it's okay and it's actually got all of the systems working properly without real people? So you've got to get the critical mass, but you've got to get the game right before you get the critical mass. It's a catch-22 every time. And then you look at things like the way a lot of the games that are out there are designed, like Call of Duty, Battlefield, all this, to a certain extent Fortnite as well, where basically you're essentially given more things the better you are. So therefore you perform even better. When ironically, you should be kind of giving the better things to the people who are less good, so that they have more chance of being able to play with somebody who is better. But of course, if you're ending up with these elite players who are constantly getting upgraded with better equipment all the time, then you're getting fractionally smaller groups of people who can compete at the end of the day. And again, I at the risk of boring people, I have talked about a mod called Weapon of Choice that was done for Quake 2. I don't know if you were aware of that one. Basically, if I shot you, I lost the rocket launcher. If I shot you again, or if I killed you again, I lost the lightning gun. Eventually, you get down to the axe. So that was called Weapon of Choice. It was a mod by Mark Smith, who now works at NVIDIA.
Like reverse gun game type thing.
Well, it is basically gun game, yeah. So James Portnow, who I was talking to the other day, was talking about when they were putting gun game into, was it COD, I think? Well, no, anyway, when he was involved in some element of that. I've forgotten exactly what involvement he had. But it was interesting how he didn't even know about Weapon of Choice as a mod. He didn't. It's amazing how these historical principles that people have put into place don't always have continuity between them. Anyway, so I'm going off on a tangent. But so this is a massive problem. How does a developer have to think about getting their game tested so that they can get enough critical mass? Because critical mass is the fundamental question of any multiplayer. It's a non-trivial problem. And then get satisfying matchmaking. What's the sort of tactics? Is it a one and done thing, or is there different stages you do different things?
No, yeah. So there's absolutely different stages, depending on the different stages of development as well. So as a high level test strategy, I guess you can say, you've got component testing, which is throughput testing of your matchmaker, throughput testing of your core database services, which might be your achievement store or your item store or whatever kind of component makes up your game, and then the actual game service itself. So you test each of those components individually, and usually that is all based on a plan of I'm aiming to achieve X type players at the end of when I release my game, which, by the way, that's like a whole nother podcast on its own of how do you predict those kind of curves of who's going to show up on day one. By the way, Steam Charts is your friend. Look at other games of similar styles that you're putting out there and look at how they've done. That's a really good thing. You can kind of build an estimate model, and when you know roughly when you're in the right ballpark, you can work out how many daily active, monthly active users am I going to have, and then you can work out how many what we call CCU or concurrent users I'm going to have on my infrastructure. That then allows you to backtrack, how many API calls am I going to have on my infrastructure? How many players are going to join my service? That kind of stuff. So that gives you a rough...
Very briefly on the CCU one, because I think CCU is a really interesting topic in itself. So I used to have a bunch of techniques which I use to estimate CCU compared to how many users you have to acquire in order to obtain the level of concurrent users in order to make a sustainable experience. And typically, I was looking at something like 6% of monthly active users as the peak concurrency. And, it obviously would be less for daily active users. So I would often use daily active users to work out what the lowest level would be, and monthly active users as a guesstimate of what peak would look like. Do you have any particular techniques that you use to kind of help people understand the difference between not just the concurrent user base, but the size of audience you have to sustain that concurrent user base?
Yeah. So as I said, this is a whole other ball game. So it varies wildly depending on game type and region in the world. So region in the world is it's very, very different. Very rough rule of thumbs. If you're looking for 50,000 monthly active users, I would use 10% as your peak concurrent daily users or users playing in sessions. So your 6% number actually not wildly off. I don't think we sort of project for 10%, but it very much depends on type of game. If we think it's like a game that is really new and something really interesting, it might go a lot bigger. We might increase that for a client, or various other bits and pieces. But yeah, use 10% as your rough maths. And again, Steam charts and like those open data sources out there that have lots of data on different types of games are really good. So you can go and look for kind of similar games that do your sort of style of gaming, because you'll also find that certain genres of games are picked up very differently by different parts of the world, right? And therefore, where your player base is going to be, that can help with, do I put servers in Asia or in, West Coast US for my game, and where should I have my distributions, and those sorts of things are very much dependent on the style of game and and that kind of stuff.
And that's all that last mile trickery that we have to think about. But I mean, I tend not to think about the kind of last mile bit until I know I've got an audience of a sufficient scale. Yeah. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's right. Like people always, there's this whole thing of when do I pick the tech stack for my game, right? And it's very easy to go, well, as early as possible. You need to know what you're building in, and you need to put multiplayer in as soon as possible. Absolutely. From a game design perspective, you need to know you're building multiplayer and bake in netcode from the start, right? You can't put that in later on. But my personal view is you've got to have a good game with a good story and a good development, and you've got to think about how your players are going to play the game first. So, go through pre-prod, figure out your kind of core game mechanics, how it's going to work, what things are going to look like. Is multiplayer an integral part of the game? And as you start to come out of pre-prod, what you will know is, are there any particular USPs to your game that are different to normal or different to other styles of game? Or what is the kind of core magic that it is making your game different? And that's where you focus the tech stack, right? That's the important stuff.
I mean, I often, when I'm doing design consultants, I'm often trying to get people to realize what they're letting themselves in for with multiplayer. Sometimes ghosting is enough for certain games. Sometimes you don't actually, and particularly around asynchronous play, I think what the benefits of asynchronous play are often underestimated. Because from a game dev point of view, I can quote unquote fake it a little bit.
100%.
But more importantly, I'm not under that peak performance threshold, which is incredibly expensive. And I think that understanding, particularly though, I think it's also about the business model of the game as well. If the game doesn't support sustainable revenue, you're going to struggle to sustain a more expensive environment like a multiplayer one. Is that fair?
Yeah, it's 100%, and it's something you've got to really think about, right? So typically, I mean, there's several styles of multiplayer game. There's hundreds of articles you can reach out there, but typically when you're talking about online multiplayer, you've got kind of two forms. You've got sort of peer-to-peer or newer type relay systems, and you've got kind of dedicated game servers, which is ultimately some sort of server running somewhere that someone dials into. Former is a bit cheaper. The peer-to-peers are obviously a bit cheaper, and the dedicated game servers are a bit more expensive because you have continuous infrastructure costs. When you're making that dedicated game server model, it's obviously fantastic for high Twitch FPSs or games that require state and a simulation to be run on the other end. But you're absolutely right. You have to monetize your game in a way that you have a way to pay for your infrastructure costs, right? Otherwise, you're going to end up in a bit of a nightmare in 5 years' time and have to shut your servers down, which quite a lot of games do. But obviously, as game developers, we want our games to live on, right?
But I think in some ways it's worse than that, because you see, if you charge up front, and that's all you've got, then every time someone plays, it's costing you your profit, which means you can't then invest in the game to therefore keep people playing, and it just a downward spiral. But also, when you talk about like peer-to-peer versus like server, you took me right back to '98 when we had literally laptop motherboards wired together to run Quake servers because it was faster than having a Sun Mini. I think it was a mini system that we originally had running the servers. This is how long ago this was. Can you imagine late 90s laptop boards running Counter-Strike? Yeah, I mean, crazy.
Amazing.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, it's a very, very long time ago. And obviously, I'm glad we're no longer there because we wouldn't be able to do this stuff the way we do it now. So
I think you were bleeding edge there, because Google's doing that now, right? They don't have servers boxed in data centers. They just have motherboards in racks because it's cheaper and more cost efficient, right? And it allows you to do it more. So maybe you were just ahead of the curve.
Well, there wasn't a rack system back in those days. That didn't exist. We kind. I don't know if this is actually true, but I like to claim we kind of invented the rack system without realizing it. But I think you're right, though. The fact that people are just sticking motherboards now, it's like going right back to that original principle, because keeping that cost down to the bare minimum is incredibly important, because it's incredibly expensive to run that amount of information as rapidly. In fact, I kind of almost wonder if we'll start seeing people using GPUs to run multiplayer games rather than CPUs. Maybe I'm being a bit extreme, but anything that allows massive serial processing of information, massive parallel processing, brain not working there, could potentially be of an interesting avenue. But then I'm not technical enough to know the difference. The other thing I was thinking about that, though, is that this whole actually, I will tell another quick side anecdote. Interestingly, when I was at PlayStation for some of the multiplayer stuff, even there we started to look back at peer-to-peer, because the way Sony was set up, they didn't have, at the time I was starting out there, we didn't have a cloud infrastructure. So how did you make sure you could scale massive connections of multiplayer sessioning? So we were starting to use peer sessioning for games within the context of, say, PlayStation Home or the virtual world. So these are the kind of interesting conundrums. They keep coming back. Peer to peer has its place. Server has its place. They do different things. Now, if I'm starting out as a game developer and I know I'm doing multiplayer, and I want to kind of understand what it needs to take it out, what are the key considerations do you think that I need to pay attention to? And do I get it off the shelf? Do I build it myself? What do you think about that?
Yeah, so I would never really recommend building it yourself unless you absolutely need to. It is a whole host of work to build. Well, you've got netcode, and then you've got whatever kind of server system you're going to be using, whether that's peer-to-peer or a dedicated game server or something like that. There are so many solutions off the shelf to do that now. There is one caveat to that, is if you're trying to do something new and exciting, and I'll be honest, you probably know a bit more than me if you're doing that, or at least you've gone out and find someone that does. So, you probably should be using something that's already out there. Then you need to.
I wholeheartedly agree with that. And actually, one of the problems I have is that people think they're doing something new, and honestly, they just need to talk to someone like Mark Val or Christoph at Photon, and they'll tell you, because they've been doing it for 15, 20 years. So anyway, carry on. Sorry.
Yeah. No, it's absolutely fine. And then you're just looking at the style of game you've got, right? And ultimately, this comes down to a few things. It comes down to whether you need a server or a simulation, right, to be authoritative about what you're playing. So that might be an FPS type shooter, something like that. And or, as you talked about, kind of async type gameplay, right, which doesn't have a kind of latency factor. It doesn't need to be things to be updated really, really quickly. Kind of a peer-to-peer style model. It is a bit better. We are starting to see a kind of new world of kind of halfway house, shall we say, which is a relay type system. So it stops your kind of or your home internet ISP firewall issues blocking things, but with a little bit of light authority in there as well. So you can do a little bit more than you would traditionally be able to do peer-to-peer, but you don't necessarily need to extend up to the full dedicated game server model, which, as you said, is ultimately can be quite expensive, especially if you're not monetizing your game somehow for kind of ongoing revenue. So that's something to consider. But yeah, the main thing would be
part of this
ultimately.
also, I'm sorry, I was just going to say part of this, I think, is also understanding what the experience is going to be. So I think with some of those relay type, and I can't remember exactly because, like I say, I'm not the technical guy, I'm the designer guy. I'm thinking in particular about the way tools like Quantum, the photon, the photon guy's tool to do real-time deterministic physics, the way they kind of switch the metaphor around rather than we input into a situation and then it resolves. The idea that the game is going to predict your behavior and then you correct. And it doesn't sound, maybe I'm not describing it right, but the point for me is that if you want to have an explosion, a wall breaks and throws bricks in real time across the road, how do you make sure the same bricks appear for all of us? Not every game needs that, but some games do. Am I making sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, again, this is all dependent on how important that is. I believe so. One of the things I would kind of come back to is I believe on the Sea of Thieves game, there's been quite a few videos I've watched about it. They sort of used the dedicated game server to synchronize the waves so that all players' waves were in sync, because obviously you don't want to do that client side because it massively affects the dynamics of the game and how it impacts the gameplay for the ships. However, as you just said, an explosion, right, which is a brilliant client side rendering thing to be able to see in the game, you don't necessarily have to have that, perfect brick synced like flying around. You don't need to do that in netcode and send it all the way to a game server and kind of I use the word waste that data and more importantly that cost. You can just render that client side, and then as long as you've kind of figured out where the bullet's going to go and that everyone has registered that it hit the right person at the right time, actually, you don't really need to render anything else. So there's a lot of what goes into the kind of client server design is thinking about what is important for us to register and for us to assimilate on the server and what isn't, because the more we can bring that down in terms of base resources to use on the server, the cheaper it's going to be. So we've worked with many clients in the past. If you've got a dedicated game server that's using 15 gig of memory and 2 gigahertz CPU, right, it's going to be really, really expensive to run your game. You're only going to be able to put 1 or 2 game sessions on quite an expensive, server. However, if you're just doing really, really light calculations on the server, you can pack 15, 20, 30, 40, 50 game servers onto one machine, and therefore your economies of scale are much better. So this is the kind of stuff you need to think about when you've done your alpha and your beta and you're kind of going into optimizations before launch, which is ultimately how can we remove as much processing as possible while still keeping the core gameplay mechanics working between our client and our server, and reduce all that overhead in terms of memory, CPU, network, because that's how we make it cost efficient to be able to run that game for as long as possible with the money that we have as a game developer.
No, exactly. I'm completely with it. And actually, I think that's really the crux of it, is like working out what has to be which side. Now, and obviously, I think often people think about it as client versus server. I think it's worth separating out config on the server side from server from client in your logic. I mean, don't get me wrong, that might sound very obvious, but the number of times, in fact, even asset server, I consider to be another section entirely. The reason I have to think about that is because I work in the live ops space a lot of the time. And it's amazing how people say, oh, okay, we'll use the client. The client's got all the assets in, job done. No, if I want to update that game and I can't do it via an asset server, then I am stuck until I have a new build. And that new build has to then be synchronized with any server components that are dependent on that update. And the amount of work it takes to sustain a game, if you haven't separated out the different layers and the components of the experience efficiently, is dramatic. I mean, we've got a game that we've converted into being a sort of live ops based game, which has not been trivial, taken far longer than it should have done. But they still don't have an asset server. So every time we have a new update, we have to have it built into the new client. And it's difficult. so I just want people to think about what the different server environments mean, and particularly I think understanding what has to be on the real-time experience versus what can be set up separate from real-time, as in config or asset. Is that a reasonable? I mean, do you have a different way of looking at it, or is that a reasonable kind of way of looking at how you divide that up?
No, absolutely perfect. So we've launched games in the past where game developers haven't done that, and they've shipped essentially a full client which has some code in it that does a dedicated game server, and we've had to ship that to thousands of data centers around the world, and it's like a 12 gig bundle, right? Like, and if you think you're doing 12 gig times literally potentially 100,000 servers, your network costs and your storage costs and stuff just go through the roof, right? So strip out any assets you possibly can do, bare bones executable with the small little dependencies that need. The smaller and more efficient it can be, the better. And if you can, as you said, break that out with config, so it's easy to build my client, build my server, it's so much easier to ship and update. The other thing to be aware of there is games. Headless server, exactly.
We want the headless server. At the end of the day, I know not everybody likes that phrase, but the headless server, to me, it's such a powerful way to think about how to remove the cost barriers of running the experience.
Yeah, and it's not just it is cost, but it's also think of a world where you've got a live running game, right, and you need to patch it, like you just said. Firstly, you've got to go and generate the new server, then you've got to get it up to wherever you're hosting it and send it out to the world. Nowadays, so we used to 15 years ago, hey, we're taking the game offline at Tuesday at 4 o'clock for 4 hours while we patch the game, right? We don't do that anymore. That doesn't exist. People want to play all the time, so we need to then.
We had to do that like 2 days ago.
Oh, did you? Yeah, sometimes it happens for back-end updates and stuff. I guess the principle that we're trying to achieve now is we don't want to do that where we don't have to. And so therefore you've got to go and ship your new headless server around the world, and then you've got to transition from build 1, which was the old build, to build 2, which is the new build, and then so again it's all this duplication of cost in terms of storage and network. So yeah, trying to optimize that and make it as small as possible, incredibly important.
But then I think there's another aspect of that, which is making sure that the client is backwardsly compatible and the server is backwardsly compatible, because I mean, you can't do it perfectly, but there's going to be a point where somebody hasn't updated their client or is connected to, somewhere there's some mix up in routing that's going to cause a problem. And how you troubleshoot for that, how you deal with that, that's a lot of work. That doesn't just happen out of the box, does it?
No, absolutely. Yeah. So there's if you can make your client backwards compatible to your server, that's brilliant, because it means you can push out a new client update and not have to worry about the servers. Fantastic. And then obviously, if you do have like a lockstep, like a really important change, and you need to push out a client and server, what we suggest is you can push out your new server, spin up a load new game servers around the world. So you've essentially got a bunch of new servers sat there, and then you release your client. Folks, and then what we usually tend to say is, when your client loads up, force people to download the newest version of the client, right? And then they get into the new game servers, and you'll slowly see this tail off of your old build of folks who have updated their client, and then a tail up of your new build as folks update. Interesting thing, if you decide to do that at peak times in the US or the UK or whatever, you will not, and then you patch your game in peak time, you'll see your players decline from your old build and they will increase into the new build. You will likely never see the same number of players as left the game than came back in the game, because most people are waiting for a 2 gig patch to patch, and they've decided, I'm going to go dinner while I've have dinner while it's patching or something like that, and so they don't necessarily come straight back into the game. So if you patch that for the first time, you're like, oh my god, where have the players all gone? That's just a natural human behavior to go, I'll do the patch later, or I'll wait till tomorrow, or I've patched and then I've gone off to make dinner. So that's something to be aware of. It's quite an interesting human phenomenon when you start doing this stuff at mass scale.
Yeah, and again, this is an interesting area, because I know there's some people exploring ways of doing continuous deployment so that you minimize the number of actual updates you have to do. So for my head, I want to get everything on the server and do the least possible updates and do them essentially kind of as someone's playing, and then it's sat there, it's down background downloading. Any change it has to happen ready for the next time you restart it, rather than having you to do a specific process. But that's not trivial. That's a massively complicated thing to get right, and QAing that is painful. Let's put it that way. So I'm going to go
absolutely.
I was going to take this in another direction. So obviously, you know, the next thing in my head when I think about, you've got clients, you've got servers, you've got the various elements. What do you think about trusting a client? Is there should you ever have a trusted client?
Again, it depends on the game. So if there is something where the simulation has an important output, like someone is going to win the game in terms of shooting, there's a match, blah, blah, blah,
Yeah.
you have to have some point of truth, right?
Yes.
And if you are doing peer-to-peer, at some point, you're going to have to trust one of the clients to make a decision as if it were a server.
Yes.
Do you want to then... if your game is then based on, you know, ongoing leaderboards for like a season or whatever, do you really want to trust the client data? The answer to me is probably no, right? You want a server making that decision ultimately, because you're reliant on that to do leaderboards and rankings, and at the end of the game, kind of push that off to a centralized server. If it's on the client, ultimately, you can't really trust it, is the simple answer to that. That being said, if you're just doing, for example, I was literally playing today OpenRA, which is the open source community's rebuild of the Red Alert, original Command and Conquer Red Alert. You know, actually, when you're doing direct IP connection and who wins there, it's not so important because it's one match, right? It's one game. There's 2 players playing or 4 players playing. You know, it doesn't necessarily need to be a big ranked match. Who's unlocked what? Who's paid for what in this new world of microtransactions and things? So, really, you just need to look at what's important for that data at the end of the game and where is it going. So, and if that is, it gets shipped towards your profile where it's adding up all the kills you've had over time and all that stuff, a server has to make that decision, not the client, I think.
I agree. And again, the reason I kind of raise it is because obviously you've got a number of agendas that come up with this conversation. And once you hit the world of multiplayer and you start hitting the point where, like you say, it becomes meaningful, it's no longer just about us playing a single game, but it's about ranking over a period of time. It's about competitions, prizes, esports. Then we're starting to get into the world of your man-in-the-middle attacks. You get, you know, even DDoS attacks. So there's a raw security problem. But probably in some ways, the one that affects players most directly, at least emotionally, is cheating. And so how we deal with cheating, I think trusting a server side is always going to be better, but it's not flawless. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, 100%. And there's lots of companies out there trying to solve this problem, right? And ultimately, it's so different on a per game basis. But yes, you've got with cheating, you've got 2 things to be aware of. So I've got the client side stuff, and am I trusted to be connected to this server, right? And all the things that go on there. And then you have your server side simulation, right? Is that client allowed to do that thing? Wait, how did they just go through that wall there? That can't happen. Or how did that person shoot this when they weren't at the correct XY coordinates? So ultimately, that's what anti-cheat solutions are doing, right? Is that player entitled to make the move or the shot or the whatever that they were allowed to make? So again, solving that for the right place for your game, right? Fast twitch FPS shooters or really important things in terms of esports and ranks and matches, you've got to have something on the server there kind of making that decision. Otherwise, just in terms of player experience, there's a lot of client-side stuff you can do to help there too.
Yeah, exactly. And again, doesn't this come down to understanding what is the thing that matters to the player in the experience, and focusing on that, delivering an experience that is trustable sufficiently, and at the end of the day, accepting that we can't solve everything. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah. I think if you told me that you could solve everything, I'd be telling you you're a liar. You know, there are so many things to think about with game design. The most important thing, as I said, as you start coming out of pre-pod is, what is the USP for your game? What's the most important thing that you're doing differently or that's important to the core gameplay mechanics? And how do we protect those and look around those, and what are the important things? As we said, let's take an FPS shooter. That is I need to have an amazing experience online. People need to be able to move really quickly. They need to be able to shoot. They need to be all this stuff. So therefore, we're looking at dedicated game servers. And anti-cheat is really important, especially when we start talking esports, leaderboards. You know, and if you're going to start charging for skins and things like that, it's incredibly important to have that right.
And that latency kind of is the crucial drive, because again, this takes me back, even back in '98, latency really mattered. And bear in mind that if you had normal dial-up modem in '98, your latency would be around 180, you know, whereas we had a particular kind of bespoke UDP method where we could get that down to about 150, and that reduction of just 30, you know, ping points made all the difference. Now most people has got, you know, no, maybe not quite single digit, but pretty, you know, 10, 20 kind of maximum at the right now, if you've got a reasonable connection. Does it mean that latency doesn't matter anymore?
Absolutely not. But we are getting better as a game development community at figuring out what the important bits are for latency and what they're not. So ultimately, yes, getting a server as close as possible to the client is going to be beneficial. However, netcodes and the way we design multiplayer games are getting so smart that actually what we're calling your latency tolerance, i.e. how does the game play under certain latencies, is getting much better. So what we usually do when we're kind of testing these games is we'll have a dedicated game server and a client, or a peer-to-peer game server, two sets of clients, and we will artificially introduce latency between the game server and the client. So what does it look like at 30%, 30 milliseconds latency? What does it look like at 50 milliseconds latency? What does it look like at 50% packet loss, 10% packet loss? So we'll artificially introduce these network failures or additional latencies into and we'll see what it plays like, right? So you as a game developer or as a gamer will know what feels good, what doesn't feel good, and you can kind of artificially see that. And you know, some games will play absolutely fine up to 100 milliseconds of latency with a little bit of packet loss. Some games absolutely will not tolerate that. So it's definitely worth seeing how your game plays. And as I said, certain stock netcodes are doing very well at kind of working around the fact that the network connection is not as good. Getting your server closest to the client as possible is always going to be good.
And for devs, I should know that you can actually get boxes. There are companies out there that will sell effectively network simulator boxes that allow you to fake bad network connection. And one of the tests that I always insist on whenever we get a game is that the game is tested live multiplayer outside of the network of the development team. So even though most of us, I say most of us, a lot of us work remotely, I still think it's important that someone who is not part of the development team independently test any game experience before you put it live. Because it's so easy for it to work on my machine. And that works on my machine is the death knell. You know, when you launch a game, and I have painful experience of this, you launch a game with bugs, and it still happens. No matter how well you try and fix the game experience, you often end up with problems. It can be drastically damaging when that happens, even with the best of intentions.
Yeah, absolutely. You don't, for what it's worth, you don't actually need to buy like a big expensive box to do the latency and network testing now. You can actually get bits of software which will artificially just add latency onto your PC just for local dev testing. So it doesn't need to be a huge thing. You can literally, your play tests in your studio on a Friday afternoon, you can have a bit of fun and introduce a little bit of latency just by running a bit of software. And that can just give you an example of what it might look like to a player that's playing on a rubbish Wi-Fi connection or doesn't have as good internet connection. So these tools are there and accessible, and it's quite an easy thing to introduce into your studio's playtesting to kind of make it as good an experience as it possibly can be.
Well, I think all you have to do is have the internet provider I have, which has 2 letters, and I used to work for them. And then suddenly your internet goes, even though it's supposed to be many megs, turns out to be a few K for no apparent reason. Anyway, I shouldn't besmirch anyone right now. So, I mean, we've talked a lot about multiplayer. We've talked about kind of the complexity of it. We talked about needing to be able to think about what it does in the design, but also the importance of it from a player experience point of view, the connectivity, the kind of thing, that the bonding elements of those things. But we've also talked about the costs associated with it and the complications associated with it. In the end, would you say that multiplayer is worth the hassle?
Yes. For me personally, I think you've got two types of games, right? You've got a game which is absolutely trying to tell an amazing story. And then you've got a game which is fundamentally trying to give an amazing experience. And I think sometimes they absolutely overlap and you combine that. They're not two different camps. But is what you're asking me, should we only have multiplayer games? Absolutely not, right? Single player games, I've played some which have absolutely blown my mind. My personal feeling as a person that's worked in the multiplayer game space for the last 20 years is that connection of people together, and having people experience that game together live is something absolutely amazing. Does it make your game development harder? Absolutely, it does. But when you see people on Reddit or Steam or whoever saying, "Oh my god, I played with my friend at 2 o'clock in the morning and we couldn't put this down, and I played with my friend from the other side of the world," and it is just an elation in terms of what you've built and how you built it. And ultimately, I think those types of games live on and live on and live on. And yeah, so for me, absolutely worth the experience, and it's a load of cool tech to go and learn as well.
And we shouldn't underestimate the joy of the cool tech. I mean, I'm going to put it slightly differently. I agree with you. Obviously, I wouldn't be still doing live ops games if I didn't think multiplayer was a massively important thing. Although you don't have to have live multiplayer to have live ops game, just so you know. But for me, it's about degrees. It's like all the best answers to these things. It depends, and it's a spectrum. And for me, it's like, I think if your game experience is not magnified by a common shared moment, then you probably got the wrong game experience. And that common shared moment, what is the best way to deliver it? And sometimes that best way to deliver it can be, I show you a picture of what I did on social media. That's not likely to be the case very often, but sometimes it could be. More likely, it's going to be that you can come and see my experience and join with my experience. And that can be done through streaming. But it equally could become by you visiting my space, you participating in my game, me joining your space and participating. That ability to show off, that ability to share, whether that's showing off my skills, my dedication, my factional preferences. I think basically what we're saying is that we're essentially allowing the technology to allow us to express ourselves as human beings through action and through identity. And I think that's what makes multiplayer such an important part of what games are, because games are such an important part of what we are as human beings. And a game, I think the two games you're describing, you've got a game which I'm going to experience, not passively, but I'm going to experience as a game, versus a game where we are going to experience it as people.
100%.
And I think if you understand that's what a multiplayer is bringing us, that's why it is a value, but it comes with responsibilities. It comes with an understanding that you will fail unless you've sought critical mass. You will fail unless you have a sustainable business. And you will fail unless you divide the experience into its components in the most efficient way possible. Does that make sense?
Yeah, 100%. Much more eloquent than I put it.
Hey, that's my job. That's what I do. I that's the marketing. But I mean, thank you very much for that. I honestly, multiplayer is such a part of my heart, even down to the fact that I sit there and I still run D&D with my friends on Discord, and I consider that to be just as much a multiplayer game. The technology needed to deliver it is not the same. We just need to have a chat service. I say just a chat service. If you asked me 20 years ago, would I be able to run that? I might have struggled. Maybe not 20, maybe 25 years ago. I'm getting that old. But now we don't need to have, to do anything complicated to set it up. We can just turn on Discord, job done, there we are. Same thing happens, I think, with a lot of
and this is just this is just an abstraction ultimately of us growing as an industry, right? Because you say, oh, it's just easy now because I just load up Discord or whatever. Well, Discord is a phenomenally complex program with thousands of servers running all over the world and like constant amounts of state. We had IRC back in the days, didn't we? That did that like at a more primitive level. The same thing's happening with multiplayer and the game code stacks and the way we do live ops services and all the different tools that have come out in the last 10-15 years, right? We're constantly iterating on these things, and as you know, we all know, games is sometimes at the bleeding edge of this tech, and sometimes not, depending on which part of it you're looking at. But it's an incredibly difficult industry, and it's moving at such pace, so that the thing that you need to do to start thinking about your title is, again, what is the difference between my game, and then once I figured out exactly what the things I want to solve and the core gameplay mechanics of my game, how can I match that to a tech that's already out there or might be coming out soon, and then where are the gaps in the middle? They're realistically the decisions you need to make, once you do and you release that multiplayer game, I guarantee that is going to be a massive life achievement ticked.
Exactly. Well, Tom, thank you very much. If somebody wants to get hold of you, what's the best way for them to do
that? Probably Twitter. Handles Tom Penrose on Twitter or LinkedIn. Come and talk to Multiplayer Wizards.
Great. And like I said, Multiplayer Wizards, again, I'm a huge fan of those guys because they're one of the few bunch of people who can go in and actually help you make sure you can convert. We had a bunch of teams who were doing some stuff on a certain third-party platform bought by another major provider, and they then stopped supporting that platform. So what do? Well, you have to call somebody in to try and help you fix it. So anyway, that's why I'm a fan of you guys. So I've been Oscar. This has been Tom. This has been your Game Dev London podcast. Thank you very much for participating with us. If you've enjoyed what we were talking about, if you found it interesting, then go onto the Discord, talk about it. Tell us your multiplayer design experiences and problems and issues. If you think that this is the sort of conversation we want to have more of, then let us know. Tell us there. And also, don't forget, you can subscribe, like, and do all the other usual social stuff. Thank you very much for taking part. This has been your Game Dev London podcast, and I'm going to say thank you to Tom and say goodbye. Goodbye.
Thanks so much.